This is it, guys, the all-new 5th generation Mini Cooper, codenamed J01. Everybody's favorite premium city car has now been given a full rework for 2024, but there are quite a few surprises in store for you. First of all, this is now a pure electric vehicle, and even more than that, this iconic British automobile is no longer made in the UK. It's actually now made in China. So how does all that change the quality, the character of the Mini Cooper, and most importantly, does it still drive like one? Let's find out together, shall we? Let's go. First things first, let's talk about the name. Now, everybody has been calling this car the Mini Cooper for ages and ages, but technically, it was never actually called that. The name of the car that you see here for the longest time has been the Mini Hatch or the Mini 3-door. It's just that everybody in the world called it the Mini Cooper. Now, finally, for the 5th generation Mini or BMW or both, they have finally made the decision to just call it exactly what everybody refers it to anyway, the Mini Cooper. So finally, we no longer have that weird confusion of names like, Mini Countryman Cooper S. Now, actually, the Mini Cooper S Countryman or things like that. So now, if it's a Mini Cooper, it's the 3-door hatch and no other model. Thank you for that, BMW. Thank you so very much. Now let's talk about the brand new car, the J01. This finally replaces the F56 4th generation model that has been around for a very, very long time. That's been around since 2013, so that makes it about 11 years old now. By German car standards, that's absolutely ancient. But actually, in fact, that F56 will live on as a heavily facelifted version of itself, now renamed as the F66. That is essentially a facelift of the current model made to look like this brand new J01. That will still have a petrol engine, and that will still be available for you to purchase if you're not quite ready, not quite willing to go full EV just yet. But that is not the point of this video. Now we're talking about the J01, the all-new 5th generation version, which will be sold alongside the F66. Now, as mentioned, this is now made in China, no longer in Oxford, UK, where the Mini has traditionally been made. Now, that was a decision made mostly for cost reasons, obviously. But now with the new tariffs imposed by the US for China-made vehicles, I think BMW or Mini will probably be rethinking that decision very, very soon. But in any case, you would be wrong to think that this car is a Chinese car, because BMW swears that it has led the development, the engineering of this car from the very beginning to what it is now. It is a true blue BMW Mini product. GWM, its Chinese partner, is merely helping to produce the car in China for lower cost. Now, BMW says that the platform was designed by BMW. It's not a shared product, it's not a shared model. There is no shared parts with any GWM products. So a lot of online reports have suggested that this platform is actually a reworked version, a shared platform with the Aura 03 or the Good Cat or the Funky Cat as it's known in Europe. Now, speaking to the BMW and Mini engineers, they have categorically denied that claim. They've said that this uses the exact same principles as the previous generation Mini. It's worked on by the same people that have been working in Mini for 10-15 years. So this is by all means a true blue Mini and not a Chinese copy. And you know what, driving it, I absolutely believe them. This does not feel at all like a Chinese car. This feels like a proper Mini. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's talk about the styling itself, which obviously is the most defining factor, the most important part of a Mini Cooper. Now on the outside, this car looks like a traditional Mini, but at least to my eyes, it looks like the simplest, the purest form of Mini styling from the absolute original Mini as styled by Sir Alec Isigonis. When BMW resurrected the Mini brand from the early 2000s, it has made the car more and more modern, and through the years, they have made the styling slightly more complicated. They've added more things to it, whereas this latest version is perhaps the greatest homage to the original, purest form of how a Mini is supposed to look. Big, round, cute eyes up front with not many styling details at all. On the outside, this is the cleanest Mini it has ever been since, of course, the original version, and I like it very much. Perhaps it doesn't really show in photos as much, but in the flesh, it looks absolutely beautiful. The simple lines, the big, great glowing eyes, and the smaller taillights at the back, everything works really, really well. Now, don't get me wrong, it has changed quite a fair bit from what we know a Mini as today. Now, at the front, the big clamshell bonnet is now gone. It's replaced by a traditional bonnet with a lot of shut lines. That's perhaps not quite as premium as the old car used to be, but I'm sure this is a lot cheaper to make, and if you ever get into an accident, it's going to be a lot cheaper to repair, to fix as well. That's definitely a good thing, I would say. And then on the sides, you no longer have the big plastic over fenders like in previous generation Mini Coopers. This has cleaned up the side profile of the car quite a fair bit. It no longer looks jacked up, and with the bigger wheels now measuring up to 18 inches, I think the proportions of the car has really progressed. It now looks absolutely sleek, it's modern, it's iconic, it's traditional as well, all at the same time. I think this is a design masterpiece by Mini and BMW. At the back is perhaps where it has changed the most. The vertical taillights have been swapped out for more triangular lamps, which, I don't know, especially with the slightly thicker chamfered side designs, sort of remind me of all cars, the Proton Iris. I don't know, is it just me, or do you see it as well? Do let me know in the comments section below. Now at the back here is where you'll see the size has grown the most. The width is the biggest part of the dimensions that have grown from the last generation. It's grown by about 30 millimeters. That's about that much. That's fairly significant. Plus, with a big black garnish bar across the rear, that sort of enhances the width, the visual width of the car as well. It does look quite a fair bit wider than before. The rest of the car though, it has only grown marginally. The length has only grown by 10 millimeters. That's the least the Mini has grown over the past few generations. The height has also grown by about 20 to 30 millimeters, but because of the bigger wheels, the side proportions hasn't really changed all that much. Now the wheelbase has also grown by about 30 millimeters. That's minimal change really, considering this is an all-new skateboard dedicated EV platform. Now that has aided the rear space most of all, but I'll show you in a bit. It hasn't really changed all that much. A Mini remains a Mini. It's not quite the most practical car that you can buy, obviously. One interesting feature is that both the front and rear lighting signatures can be customized. Right off the bat, you'll have 3 separate settings for the headlight DRL and the taillight graphics that you can choose from. That is a nice way to customize your Mini to your absolute liking. The rear taillights especially, you can choose from 3 very distinct patterns, but my favorite will always be the Union Jack pattern. Although, of course, the car is now clearly more German or even Chinese compared to being British. But yeah, who cares, right? Cool is always going to be cool. Moving on inside though, it is a completely new and modern experience. They have completely rejigged the entire interior to make it look and feel as close as possible to the original classic Mini Cooper. If you were to put the two dashboards side by side, the original classic and this latest version, you can clearly see a very clear connection of the general layout. There is this big central speedometer. The first of its kind was for the original Mini, obviously, and just below that is a series of toggle, which for the new car also includes this really novel start function. This looks like a really tiny old school circular key that you twist to start or turn off the car. I think this is a genius design. You've also got a few toggles, one for the gear selector, one more for the driving experiences, or rather the driving mode selection. But you know what? That's as far as all the physical buttons and toggles go on this car. And pretty much everything else is clumped into this big OLED circular screen. That itself is something that is significant. Obviously, it's the first of its kind, a circular OLED display, and it looks absolutely brilliant. The screen itself is very, very thin. The display is so sharp, so crisp, and no matter the lighting, whether it's bright, sunny day, you will see all the numbers that you'd want to see in absolute clarity. It looks beautiful. But of course, that is the only display that you have in this entire dashboard. So you'll have your speedometer, your range, your navigation all clumped into this big screen right there, which is far from ideal. But rather than being like a Tesla where that's all it gives you, there is also a traditional HUD, a head-up display right ahead of the driver. There is no longer a small meter cluster in front of you. That's all been replaced by a pretty decent looking color HUD. That works pretty well, and it cleans up the dashboard as well. The rest of the dashboard uses this, recycled fabric knit pattern, which I think looks really cool, but it does feel a little bit rough to your fingers, I would say. Now, this of course matches perfectly BMW and Mini's eco-friendly or eco-conscious direction right now. It's all using recycled materials, recycled plastics, and so on. It does look fairly premium, but it does lose out on having plush, soft materials like in previous generation Minis. The old Minis have always had this air of, luxury in it for a small car. It has always felt like a very premium car. It has that air of luxury in it. This new one, however, doesn't quite have that air of premiumness. Everything you can feel, everything you can touch are all practically hard, and even the leather don't quite feel quite as good because these are now fake vegan leather instead of real genuine article, of course. Even the plastic bits further down below are all now hard to the touch, and yeah, while it doesn't quite feel like a Chinese car like I've mentioned before, it doesn't quite feel as plush or expensive as the previous version. That has been lost in translation a tiny bit. That is a bit of a disappointment. The door cards, especially where it hides the speaker grills, it feels particularly rough and hard to the touch. Yeah, I'm not a fan. The seats though is a big improvement over the old car. It is now slightly wider, slightly more supportive, but of course it does feel a little bit flat, less supportive than, more comfy seats from bigger, more luxurious cars. Now, as for the last row, you can only seat two, of course, as usual for a Mini. There is slightly more legroom than before by about 1 centimeter, although headroom has improved by a slightly bigger margin. It is still far from being the most comfortable, the most practical car around, obviously, but for its purposes, driving around the city with your friends, I think it should be big enough. It should be more than comfortable enough for that usage. Safety though has been given a big boost this time. You now get no less than 8 airbags in this tiny cabin. The 2 additional airbags are of course the rear side airbags, which are now standard across the range. So you've got small airbags that protect the sides if you ever get into a side impact crashes. That is always good to know. This may be one of the smallest cars on the road, but it's also one of the safest. As for active safety, this being a modern car, it gets the full suite of level 2 semi-autonomous driving, and driving around on the highways here in Europe, in Spain, it actually works quite well. Pretty smooth in terms of its power delivery and brake activation, one of the better ones out there. But how it will tackle our more, say, challenging local roads back in Malaysia, we'll have to wait and see when this arrives there. I'll give you a more comprehensive report when I get a chance to drive it back home. Now let's talk about how this car actually drives. This being a Mini, it is still a front-wheel driven car. There is just a single electric motor powering the two front wheels. Now power has gotten up slightly, and this is now slightly quicker than the previous generation Mini Electric. 0 to 100 is done in just 6.7 seconds. Again, far from being the quickest electric vehicles around, but it is more than quick enough for a Mini to feel lively. If anything, if it's any quicker than this, it's perhaps gonna feel a bit too quick for its own good. As it is an absolute perfect match to the rest of the car in terms of handling, in terms of suspension feel, and so on. Biggest difference to the last generation Mini Electric is in range. It has practically been doubled. The old car was claimed to do about 230 kilometers of range, whereas this is now claimed to reach up to 400 kilometers on the WLTP test cycle. That is far more usable. That comes via a much larger battery, almost twice the size as before, with a usable battery size of just under 50 kilowatt hours. Now, finally, BMW Mini is using an LFP pack, most likely sourced from China, and you are free to charge this up to a full 100% anytime you want without having to worry about long-term battery degradation. The previous NMC batteries, because the chemistries are different, you are always recommended to charge it up to 80-85% at max on a regular basis. Now you can go up to full 100%, get the full 400 or closer to 350 kilometers in the real world, I would guess, and I think that's pretty good. Now, in fact, against its usable battery size of just under 50 kilowatt hours, 49 kilowatt hours, to get 400 kilometers, you'd have to average around 12 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers, which sounds a little bit ambitious, to be honest with you. Now, for this test, I haven't been driving this car in a normal manner at all. You are supposed to test every facet of this car's, ability, its handling, and so on. So I cannot quite give you a clear gauge of this car's power consumption right now. Again, that will come when I get hands on this car back home in Malaysia through my regular everyday drives. But having said that, the fact that this car now weighs over 1.6 tons and it only has a 50 kilowatt hour battery to reach 400 kilometers and average 12 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers, it sounds like a very big ask, I think. Then again, these guys being German, I don't think they would be so willing to over-promise. So yeah, we shall see very, very soon, I hope. Now let's talk about the handling aspect of this car. And you know what? It has very much been influenced by the heavier weight of this vehicle. Being a purely dedicated EV platform, it is of a skateboard design obviously, and the big flat battery has been placed right under where I'm sitting right now, just at the bottom of the platform. The increased weight by around 200 kilograms is very, very significant. It's impossible to fully escape a heavier weight penalty when we are talking about a pure electric car, of course. But speaking to the engineers here in Spain, they've said that heavier mass at the very bottom of the platform does do a lot of good for a car's ride and handling. That's both ride and handling. Yes, you heard that right. In terms of comfort, having heavier weight overall does give it a more favorable sprung to unsprung weight ratio, according to the ride and handling specialist. Because of this, when you're driving out on the open roads, the body can stay more stable, flatter across bumpier surfaces, especially at slightly higher speeds like on the highway. And having driven this car about 200 kilometers yesterday, I can attest that in terms of highway refinement, highway comfortability, this is far, far superior compared to the overly bumpy, overly jumpy last generation Mini Cooper SE. Lower speed ride, however, as I'm sure you can see that I'm just, bouncing around, bobbing around everywhere, has seen a less dramatic improvement, obviously. Where we are right now, this is Sitges, about 50 kilometers south of Barcelona. The roads are not quite the best, but at the same time is, I would say, fairly similar to our city centre, or say Bangsa back home in Malaysia. So it's a pretty good gauge of what the car is going to feel like back home on local soil. As it is, the low speed ride still remains very, very busy, but again, according to the engineers, if they had made it far softer, it wouldn't even feel like a true blue Mini to begin with. It's not quite as crashy or as jumpy as the old car, so yeah, it is an improvement across the board, but more so on highway comfort rather than in town. A price to pay by having a big flat battery under the floor, however, is that BMW or Mini has had to raise the front seats quite a fair bit higher. Now, they haven't given me the exact dimensions just yet, but sitting in this car, it does feel like I'm sitting less so in a sporty hatch, but slightly more like a small crossover perhaps. I'm almost perched up over the seats over here, looking down at the bonnet and the sides as well, so it doesn't quite feel as engaging as the old car right from the go. And that has an effect in terms of driving dynamics as well, because I do feel like I'm sitting slightly higher up. It doesn't quite feel like that traditional super athletic, super direct go-kart feel of the old car. Now, don't get me wrong, this is still by far and away the most dynamic feeling car of its class. If you are to drive this back to back with, say, a Smart #1, the difference is absolutely night and day. While the Smart #1 feels like a Chinese car, above all else, this feels like a proper European tuned vehicle, and one tuned by BMW and Mini at that, which is the best in the business for a car like this. Through a carefully picked roads yesterday, this car does feel almost incredibly athletic. The steering wheel is still extremely direct, and it is an absolute hoot to drive fast, much more so than any other EV that I can think of. It really does retain that iconic Mini fun to drive factor, but perhaps in a slightly diluted fashion because of the higher weight, the higher sitting position, and a slightly muted steering as well. But paired together with a much improved ride quality over highways, I think this is now a much better all-rounder than before. One thing that is sure to put a smile on your face, however, is the artificial sounds that are available on this car. Let's say you switch it into its go-kart mode and you press the throttle, you get this big fake engine sound, as you can hear right now. Yeah, that is an absolute hoot, really. Yeah. And then when you lift off, it sounds a little bit like the Jetsons car. Is absolutely hilarious. They've also got a few other sound options. Say you move it down to something called timeless mode, and according to the engineers, they've actually sampled the sound of the original classic Mini, and apparently they've reworked that sample to make it sound slightly more futuristic. I'll just give it a go right now. Yeah, still sounds like a spaceship to me. It doesn't sound at all like an old, throaty, actual engine. So, yeah. But in any case, it is just, a few fun things that you can do with this car. I think it adds to the fun factor overall. It doesn't quite feel as fake or as synthetic as all the BMW iconic sounds, I would say. This has a tinge of fun to it. It's like they're not taking itself too seriously. Speaking of driving modes, if you do put it on its most hardcore settings called go-kart mode, that does tune up the throttle response to be at its peakiest, and it also increases the steering force to make it a bit more lively through the bends. Now, to be honest, I did try it for a short period of time yesterday. I didn't really feel that big of a difference other than the big sound that I just showed you just now, but I suppose this is already very dynamic to begin with. It doesn't really need an extra Sport Plus mode to make it more fun. So to wrap up, I would say that this J01 MINI Cooper SE is quite a big improvement over the old Mini Electric. Its range has practically doubled. It is more fun to drive than ever, and it is slightly more practical as well, but at the same time it has lost a little bit of that original Mini charm along the way, which is a bit sad really. But as a whole, it's more comfortable now. It is a much more complete all-rounder than before, which to its target customers will be a perfect combination of style, of practicality, of range, and of course driving enjoyment. Plus, best of all, they can just now call it a Mini Cooper without drawing any form of confusion. That itself means that this is a success in my books. Of course, I'll give you a more thorough review when I get to drive this car back home in Malaysia. For now, if you're waiting for this car, I think you will absolutely love this Mini Cooper SE. If you're ever afraid that it's going to feel a bit more like a Chinese car rather than a proper Mini, yeah, that is not the case at all. I'm very happy to report. So, I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, everyone.